Professor Richard Ned Lebow and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We welcome you all to another important webinar of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement on national identities in international relations. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on a very important topic of today, we have Professor Richard Ned Lebow. Professor Richard Ned Lebow is a professor of international political theory in the Department of War Studies, King's College London, and James O. Freedman Presidential Professor Emeritus at Dartmouth College. He is also a Bye-Fellow at Pembroke College, University of Cambridge. He has taught strategy and the National and Naval War College and served as a scholar in residence in the Central Intelligence Agency during the Carter administration. He has held visiting appointments at the University of Lund, University Science Po, University of Cambridge, Austrian Diplomatic Academy, Vienna, London School of Economics and Political Science, Australian National University, University of California at Irvine, University of Milano, University of Munich, and the Frankfurt Peace Research Institute. He has authored and edited 40 books and nearly 300 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He is a fellow of the British Academy. His research interests fall within two themes: theory, where he deals with international relations, conflict management, war and strategy, psychology of decision-making and learning, ancient and modern political theory, identity and its politics and ethical consequences, and other is like policy, which includes conflict prevention and management, regional conflict, bargaining and negotiation, strategy and intelligence. Some of his recent books are Ethics and International Relations, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, Between Peace and War, 40th Anniversary Edition, New York, Palgrave Macmillan 2020, Taming Sino-American Rivalry, co-authored with Feng Chang, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2020, Reason and Cause, Social Science in the Social World, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, A Democratic Foreign Policy, Regaining American Influence Abroad, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019, The Rise and Fall of Political Orders, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, Max Weber and International Relations, which was edited by him and published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, Avoiding War, Making Peace by Palgrave Macmillan 2017, National Identifications and International Relations, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, Return of the Theories, Encounters with Great Thinkers of the Past, which was co-edited and published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016, and many other books which you can find on the website. Professor Lebow, once again, let me welcome you to NICE. Please make your initial remarks in 30 to 35 minutes or 40 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their questions in the Zoom chat room or on the Facebook Live. So, Professor Lebow, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to meet with all of you and to talk today about national identifications and international relations. I suppose it's a good thing that travel is impossible at the moment, because otherwise this event would not have occurred. On the other hand, I can imagine the counterfactual of being with you in Kathmandu, which would certainly be pleasurable. I explained to my host that my first visit to your country, where I gave a talk at the university, was just about 50 years ago. And I returned to Nepal maybe 15 years ago. It was like coming to a different country. So much had changed in the second half of the 20th century. I was struck, as I am traveling everywhere, the extent to which national identities are both important, but also extremely difficult to pin down in substance. The literature in international relations, particularly the constructivist literature, has made identity and national identity their master variable, seeking to use it to explain foreign policy, the way realists turn to power for the same end. I find problems with both. Today, however, I'm going to focus on the problems of identity because that's the subject at hand. I'm going to start by talking about individual identity and then go from there to national identity, asking what's the difference between the two and in what ways is national identity important to people because states are not persons. So let me begin by telling you a story. When I first became interested in identity as a topic, I decided I would teach a seminar on the subject. This is always a good way to learn because you're forced to read broadly in the literature and to discuss it and explain it to students and also get their feedback and understanding of what it is they're reading. In the West, ever since the rise of Romanticism in the 19th century, people have been taught that they're unique, that they have an inner self that gives them this unique identity, and that their primary responsibility, or among their primary responsibilities in life, is to discover who they are and to express their inner selves. Together with this comes the notion that everybody is unique. In this sense, in Western culture, identity is the secular follow-on to the idea of having a soul. So I asked students if they were unique, and they looked at me as if I were crazy. Why would I ask such a question? Of course we're unique. So I said, fine. So take out a piece of paper. Don't put your name on it, but write down 2, 3, 4, 5 reasons why you think you're unique and pass it in. So people did this. I then read out what people had written to the members of the seminar. And very quickly, after 3, 4, 5 students, it became apparent to everyone that they were all claiming to be unique for the same reasons. And this created a conundrum. How can you be unique if you're unique because of your concern for others? You went through the list. And this was a problem for them. And one of the bright students in the class said, oh, well, Professor, we're unique because we have different life experiences. And I said, well, that's certainly true, but how do you know about them? And in what ways does it make you unique? And she explained that it's mediated by memory. So the next week's assignment was about memory, how it's studied by psychologists, how their research reveals that memory is a resource that we constantly remake in response to social cues to make ourselves more acceptable to our peer group or our society. In the end, lots of experiments suggest the extent to which memories converge. So people become, even with their memories, more like one another than different from each other. Unless you've had a serious trauma in your life. But here too, those traumas are remembered and described according to a common set of scripts. So the first point that I want to make in my talk today, and it is an unconventional point, although those of you who come from South Asia will understand that Buddhism has a perspective on memory very similar to the one I'm going to advance to you today. contrary to Western notions that we all have an identity, I'm going to argue that it is a fiction. It's something that we invent, and I'll give a few reasons why we've invented it, particularly in the modern era. Having talked about individual memory, I will talk a little bit about the difficulties, individual identity. I'll talk a little bit about the difficulties of using identity as a guide for behavior, for ethics, for even defining who we are. In the second part of the talk, I'll come to national identities, and I'll distinguish them from individual identities. I'll suggest what they have in common and where they are different. I will then look in the final part of the talk at the implications of so-called national identities, because they're no more real than individual ones, what the implications are of these fictional creations for foreign policy. I will conclude by reflecting back on the constructivist paradigm and its use of identity as a master variable. So that's a lot to do, but I think I can do it within the time limit that you've been kind enough to allot me. Let's start with the concept of identity. And let me argue that it's very much, at least in the West, a modern development. In ancient times, and really up until the Renaissance, people thought of themselves and others thought of them in terms of the roles that they perform. Persona, the Latin word for face, means the public face that you put on when you interact with others. So identity was a kind of observable external phenomenon that was role associated and role dependent. The idea of an inner separate self had not very strongly emerged, if at all. In the modern era, two things happened, and here Kant and Hegel were among the first to recognize this. The sense of the inner self developed and was encouraged by society. Although St. Augustine had written a biography in Roman times, autobiography, it wasn't until the late 18th century that people began writing autobiographies, from Montaigne and Boswell and Benjamin Franklin, making it a genre. Novels and tragedy began to emphasize the internal lives of their characters, in contrast to early literature. So the inner self became foregrounded. And what this means is that it encouraged people to step back from the roles they performed and ask themselves who they are, who they want to be, and develop for the first time a sense of self. The second thing that happened, and here Hegel is the one who really has his finger on the pulse, is that in the modern era, we began to assume a much greater variety of roles. So, think about yourself. You have a family in which you play a role. You may have partner and children. If you're my age, you even have grown grandchildren. So you play roles in the family, and quite different ones depending on whom you're relating to. You're a professor or a professional of some kind, where you have roles. You may be a mentor of your students or people in a sports club. You do all kinds of other things in which you have roles. In each of these roles, you present yourself differently because of the circumstances and demands of the role. This leads you to act as if you were multiple different people. To the extent to which you have an inner self, it's natural to reflect on what's going on and to see yourself drawn into these different roles, acting as different people. And you ask yourself, is there a real me there? So identity becomes important in the modern world, both because of the great development of the inner reflexive self, the need to perform diverse roles, and the uncertainty and alienation even that combination brings about. So we search for some wholeness in ourselves. And the Romantics, who began really with Rousseau, but followed up in Germany with the idealist philosophers, encourage us to believe that we have such an identity and that it is our principal responsibility to discover it and to act it out and to actualize ourselves. Now, the truth is something quite different. Any number of psychological and other studies, some of which I've been involved with, suggest that instead of having an identity, what we have are a large number of identifications, that we momentarily think of ourselves in particular ways, that these identifications are associated with the roles that we perform, with the affiliations that we have, with our relationship to our bodies. I mean, try the counterfactual experiment of putting yourself into the body of the other gender and imagining what you would be like. It's very difficult to do so because we're so rooted in our sense of our own gender, most people, and people who aren't struggle to find out who they are. And finally, we have biographies. And those biographies are not only individual, but they're the biographies of any groups, collectivities with whom we identify. So we have identifications that develop in each of these categories. So just in my case, as a role, in my role, I'm a professor is my principal role. I'm a scholar and researcher. And those roles, as I'm sure those of you listening know, are sometimes in conflict and sometimes reinforcing. I've been an administrator at various times during my career running research institutes. That's a very different role and often, again, in conflict more than it is supportive of my research and teaching. My affiliations, I care deeply about members of my family, my friends, my students. I have a relationship to my body. And it's interesting just how much that is your sense of self. Certainly in the West, if you're feeling ill, you often say, I'm not myself today, suggesting how much your body defines who you are. And we have histories. We have personal histories. We're often affiliated with ethnic groups or nationalities or religions. And all of these have histories that tell you who you are. Now, these identifications are not stable. Their character changes over time. And they also rise and fall in importance over time and are very sensitive to priming and context. So if somebody comes to see me and they're wearing a scarf or a hat that suggests they root for a particular football team, they're priming me to think of myself as a sports fan and an affiliate of the team that I like. If they come holding a copy of Plato in their hands, I'll think of myself quite differently in how I respond to them. So all of this suggests that these identities not only rise and fall in importance, are subjective, very much so, and are a function of context in their relative importance, which means that we have something more approaching phenomenal selves than actual selves. And here, again, I refer to Buddhist thought, which questions the notion of identity and sees it as a kind of delusional phenomenon that on the whole tends to have awkward consequences. So it is with individual memories. Now, there has been good research on individual memory, and the person I want to talk about here in this connection is George Herbert Mead, M-E-A-D, a late 19th, early 20th century American pragmatic philosopher cum psychologist, who wrote a book published late in his life, about 1930, on identity, where he introduces the concept of me and I. And this is important not only for understanding individual identity, but it's a key to understanding the difference between national identities and individual ones. According to Mead, the me are all of the identifications that society imposes on you. You're a man, you're a woman, you're a Muslim, you're a Jew, you're a New Yorker, you're French, you're handicapped, whatever it is. Society imposes categories. Some of them beneficial to you if they allow you preferential access to resources and status. Others of them definitely derogatory and not helpful to you if you're cast as a member of a group that is underprivileged, suspect, unwanted, or exploited. And here too, these categories of the me may change over time as society's values evolve. I think the most dramatic example in the West is changed thinking about sexual preference and race. Certainly in the United States, there's been a huge positive change in my lifetime in thinking about people with darker skins. Racism is still, alas, alive and well, but much less so than when I started school after World War II and grew up in an era basically of segregation. I didn't meet my first Black person. There was one African-American student in my high school. It was in a different year. I didn't meet somebody until I went to university. All of that's changed. So as residential segregation broke down, my kids grew up with people who came from everywhere. And attitudes have changed. And the same is true with respect to homosexuality, which was formerly against the law and now is simply accepted and treated in a more benign way, except of course in conservative Republican Christian circles where it's still very much an issue. So that's the me. The I for Mead is our effort to develop our own sense of self, to either accept or reject the categories of the me that are imposed on us, to reformulate them in ways to make them more acceptable to us and more advantageous for us in our relations with others, or to create our own sense of self that involves new categories or rejection of categories altogether in some ways. The I, according to Mead, is always an uphill struggle because society is so dominant in not only shaping you, but in shaping others' perceptions of you. And it's a real struggle to escape from them. You need resources, education, support from others to do so. So if that is the story of individual identity, there's one other piece to it that needs to be mentioned. And that is that identity plays a central role in politics. So the identities that constitute the me that are imposed on you by the society are propagated and supported by those who expect to gain from it, either politically, economically, or in terms of status. And much of politics is a struggle over imposing identities on people or freeing them from certain identities. So the notion of the self imposed by the society, or even the notion of self chosen by you, is very much in response to the social cues and pressures that you get from others. By controlling the state, by controlling school curricula, by influencing the media, people can shape others' understanding of themselves. Nationalism is, of course, the most prominent example of this. It encourages people to think of themselves primarily in terms of their national affiliation. Nationalists everywhere do this. Well, it's, let's say, equally prevalent in India as in Pakistan. They have mirror images, as do Israelis and Palestinians and Chinese and Indians, anybody you look at, in trying to get people to think of themselves in terms of the national identity and to privilege that identification above all others. And they do this because to the extent to which you fall into this trap, then you can be manipulated by them to advance their particular political projects. And I would argue that nationalism is perhaps the most pernicious of all identities in the modern era, because it is responsible for more exclusion and violence than other forms of identification, although today, alas, it's also rivaled by religious identifications, many of which try to do the same thing. But here, it's interesting as well that in every religion, there are moderates and extremists, and it's the extremists in each religion who are the ones who propagate the most exclusionary views and propagate the most violence as well. And these extremists, regardless of whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, they share more in common with one another than they do with the moderate practitioners of their own religion. So there's a struggle within religions of imposing particular kinds of identifications, both the strength of identification with the religion, but also the particular nature of that identification, because it advances or hinders particular political projects. If we look to our identity for guidance, we don't get very far, because, as I noted, these identifications are often in conflict with one another. They tell you to behave in different ways. If I'm interacting with somebody and I'm primed to see them as a friend, I'm going to respond differently than if I see them somehow as a member of an outgroup about whom I'm supposed to be suspicious. If I see them as a friend, as opposed to wearing my hat as a professor and seeing them as a student, I'll respond differently to them. And as these identifications, as I've noted, are both labile and subject to priming and context, we get very different policy or personal imperatives depending upon highly subjective circumstances. So looking to yourself for guidance just gets you into a mess. And yet, one of the themes of the modern age is that this is what we should do. And constructivism as a paradigm, alas, falls into this trap. Now, let me turn to international identifications or national identifications and their implications for international relations. George Herbert Mead, as you now know, distinguishes between the me and the I. I'm going to argue that states have no I, only a me. And states don't have an I because they're not people. They don't have psyches, they don't have emotions, they don't have inner lives. They're simply institutions. They're blank slates on which people write messages and attempt to impose meaning. And much domestic politics is a struggle for imposing particular understandings of what your state is. I live for much of the year in London. I've lived through the last 5 years, the Brexit disaster. And Brexit is clearly an issue that's primarily about identity. Those who support Brexit see it as enabling the British to regain their sovereignty, as if they ever lost it, to act themselves, to be independent of Europe. They also have a notion of what Britain is, which is a largely white Christian country that doesn't want further immigration, that's unhappy with, quote, non-British people who are already there, as if there is such a thing as British people. I mean, they've always been a function of one wave of immigration after another, going back to the Celts and the Angles and the Saxons and the Romans and the Vikings. On the other hand, those who wanted to remain in the EU see themselves not only as British, but as European. And the European identification is very important to them for personal, economic, political, and cultural reasons. There's a sharp divide as well in age group. People over the age of 60 overwhelmingly voted for Brexit. People under the age of 35 overwhelmingly voted against it. So you have an older group of people threatened by the changes in society, wanting to turn the clock back to a world that never was. So Brexit, for most people, was a kind of nostalgia, identity nostalgia. And opposition on the part of younger people was based, in their view, on the reality of today's world, which they accept and some even revel in. One of the reasons I enjoy living in London is that it's a cosmopolis. It's composed of people from everywhere. Less than half the population of London was born in the United Kingdom. This makes it very attractive to me, and having grown up in New York City, which was among the first major cities of the world in the modern era to be a place like this, and a city in which I was an immigrant to as a child. This is very appealing. For those who vote for Brexit, it's very threatening. So this big political battle, which has enormous consequences for Britain and Europe and presumably even the world, is a function of making identity a political issue and trying to impose a different me on the state. And to do that, encouraging people as individuals to frame their identities in particular ways. Now, if we look at national identities, they are similar to individual identities in that they're based on roles, affiliations, bodies, in this case, territories, and histories. I will just note role because I don't have time to go through each of these categories. In the modern system, different roles emerged and had different degrees of status associated with them. So great powers were at the top, although the Soviet Union and the United States managed to create the notion of superpower, which was something of even higher status above great power. And great powers not only had status, they demanded special privileges in return for their alleged responsibilities for maintaining order. The Soviet Union and the United States did the same with their claims to be superpowers, and the United States now claims to be a unipole and a hegemon. It's not. Well, we can talk about that if you like in the question and answer session, but the principal reason for making this claim, there are two. One is that it's a justification for demanding special privileges in foreign policy that work to the advantage of the US and probably to the disadvantage of others. And secondly, and this is a key sense of identity, is it confers self-esteem. People are not only interested in security and wealth, they're just as much concerned with self-esteem. And the way you develop self-esteem is by excelling in activities valued by your peer group or society, winning their approbation, and in turn feeling good about yourself. So being a great power feels good to the citizens of that country, makes them more supportive of the state, more willing to pay their taxes, more willing to die in battle. And being a hegemon has now become central to Americans' understanding of themselves. Look at Trump's campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," appealing to that sense of self-esteem and trying to associate himself with it and winning quite a bit of support in the process, despite how irrational others of us viewed his appeal and his claims. So what we have is this notion of self-esteem achieved through roles, achieved through having a history which marks you out from others, achieved by attaining markers that international society has argued confer status. So in the 19th century, these included a colonial empire and a navy, rebuilt cities, cultural institutions, excelling in science. Following World War II, nuclear power, national airlines, sending rockets into space and to the moon. These markers have evolved, but they confer status. And when we look at the foreign policies of countries, we see that they act in ways to try to achieve status in the eyes of others, both because it's useful for their foreign policy, but most importantly, because it's useful for their governments, because it enhances the self-esteem of their populations. So national and individual identities become connected by these means. We also find that states, like individuals, claim to be unique and to have status for roughly the same reasons. So there are sharp parallels here. And the last one I want to leave you with is the constructivist notion that identity is a master variable, that somehow states need to, want to, are constrained to act in terms of their national identities. As I've argued, there's no such thing as a national identity. In this sense, it's no different from an individual identity. It is a mishmash or a mélange of different identifications that rise and fall in importance as a function of context and priming. To turn to them for guidance doesn't take you very far. It doesn't take you very far because these identities may be suggesting very different ways of behaving, diametrically opposed ways when it comes to such things as intervention, foreign aid, human rights, refugees, any of the important issues in the world today. Depending on which identity gets mobilized, it gives you a different policy direction. We thus face a situation where analysts have oversimplified reality. What often happens is that so-called national identities are mobilized to justify policies which have been decided on for other reasons. So an empirical question, and one that isn't asked often enough, is the extent to which a national identity or identification is the source of a foreign policy or a justification offered for it to make it more appealing to a domestic population. And I suspect that the latter is more often the case. And finally, even if you argue for the importance of these identifications for either personal behavior or policy, they are so broadly construed and amorphous that they very rarely give you a specific response. You have a range of responses or policies that could be made consistent with them. So if we have this kind of understanding of individual and national identity, we really need to rethink the intellectual tools we use to study them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lebow. Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. It was really enlightening and we learned a lot. Thank you very much for your time. We have already received a lot of questions. I can see around 26 in my list that I have received from my team. So without taking much time, please allow me to share the questions with you. The first question is, with globalization and fragmentation of populations and people having loyalty towards more than one nation state, how do you see the national identity impacting international relations?
Well, I tell you how I would like to see it. As I noted, my view of nationalism is that it, in theory, can play a positive role by creating solidarity among a people. But very often that solidarity is created at the expense of other people, and often other people who are members of the society, because so often nationalism is exclusive rather than inclusive. To the extent to which national identities become blurred, the human race benefits. The more of us who think of ourselves as having national identities as only one of our many identifications, the better off we are. And the more that we define our sense of national identity in an inclusive rather than exclusive way, the better off we are and everybody else is. And here, again, there are strongly contrasting views. My own view is cosmopolitan, as I noted to you. I have 2 citizenships. My wife has 3. We live in 3 different countries. We speak multiple languages. We're familiar with multiple cultures. All of this leads us to diminish the importance of having a single strong national identity. We're both professors, so that means the people to whom we are the closest professionally are from different cultures, different religions, different places in the world. We exchange manuscripts, we critique each other's work, we meet at conferences. These identifications transcend nationality. One of the reasons I like teaching at King's College is that fewer than half of the students are British. Not that I have anything against the British, but rather I like the idea of having a classroom that's truly international in its makeup, and the same with the faculty. We're now something over 100 faculty at the War Studies Department, and I think only about 30% are British by origin. The rest come from all over the world. We all benefit from this. So that's my answer to you. I have a personal project here, which is to have us rethink and move away from strong national identifications.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is, what is the future direction of constructivist IR theory in the light of identity reiteration and deglobalization?
And what was the last term?
Deglobalization.
Oh, deglobalization. Okay, so I think in part I've answered that question, that trying to use identity as a master variable to analyze foreign policy doesn't get you very far. There's a chapter in the book I'm talking about today, the National Identifications in International Relations, that in particular goes after the ontological security research program, arguing that it's very hard to see ontological security as anything meaningful, either psychologically or politically. That international relations scholars, to the extent to which they turn to identity, need to use it in far more nuanced and complex ways, as various people are beginning to do.
We have a few more questions on immigration. I'm trying to club them together. How immigration will impact national identities? Is multiculturalism a threat to nationalism today?
Well, it's all in the eyes of the beholder. So I grew up in New York City. New York City has always had, like Los Angeles today, a very high percentage of immigrants. And I grew up in an immigrant neighborhood in New York City, in Queens, where everybody accepted us as Americans very quickly. And to become an American, to become a New Yorker, you only had to speak English, have a baseball team who you rooted for, and that was it. Now, a sense of nationality that is not based on inheritance, but on affiliation, is one that is open to others. It's welcoming. It makes people want to identify with the nationality because they're encouraged to and receive rewards for doing so. As a result, the United States and Canada, another example, have been able to absorb people from everywhere who become American and who are understood as being Americans. And it's only a minority of people, many of them uneducated, more from the South than elsewhere in the country, and more of them strongly identifying evangelical Christians than others, who are dubious about this. I mean, you need only look at the response to Kamala Harris as vice president. For most people, fine, she's vice president. And one evaluates her on the basis of her qualifications. For some people, however, it's a fact that she's an immigrant of mixed identity that's important. Now, 100 years ago, that would have been the primary identification. It no longer is. By contrast, we have countries that have defined nationalism on the basis of birth or of belonging to a particular ethnic group or religion. Those kinds of nationalisms inevitably lead to conflict in areas where there's a lot of immigration. They also lead to conflict even in the absence of immigration if there is differential economic development in the country that benefits one group at the expense of the other. So very clearly, I'm in favor of multiculturalism for two reasons. The first is that everybody benefits from it. The more you exclude some group of people from your society, the more you punish yourself as well in the process. And the second reason is that, as I've argued, overall, nationalism has had a malign influence, and it's had a malign influence not because it's nationalism, but the way it's been defined in an exclusionary manner. If we think of nationalism in an inclusive self and recognize others who are in our midst, who become like us and act in terms of our values, then nationalism can play a positive role. It's interesting that the first theorist of nationalism, Wilhelm Gottfried Herder in Germany, was enthralled by the idea that nationalism foregrounded different values and practices of different people around the world. He thought that this simply enriched the human tableau, that everybody benefited from this diversity. If we could come around to accepting this point of view, then I think the world would be a happier place.
So next question is, what is the consequences of colonialism against national identities under neoliberal globalization? As the hegemony of cultures form a barrier becomes detrimental in nature?
Well, that's a very difficult question because it has too many components put in it. So, I mean, colonialism, it's very interesting. It illustrates my example of inclusion and exclusion. And I can recommend a very good book on this, published, I think back in maybe 1959 by Rupert Emerson, Emerson, called Empire and Nation. It looked at the first really serious study of the emergence of nationalism in colonized countries. And he argued that there was a common pattern, that the indigenous elite, the children of the indigenous elite, often received Western educations and were encouraged to believe that if they acted like Westerners, spoke the language, dressed the dress, walked the walk, that they would be accepted. But they weren't. And at some point, they had this realization that they were being rejected despite all of their assimilation and accomplishments. Gandhi, among others, has written about this in his autobiography. It was a defining moment when he had a first-class train ticket in South Africa. And he was nevertheless forced to sit in the third-class section and give up his seat to a white woman who didn't have a first-class ticket. So this native elite was caught between its indigenous society, whose values it had in part moved away from, and the colonial society into which it had tried and failed to assimilate. So it was in a liminal space and developed local nationalism as a response to make themselves whole, to win support from others, and ultimately to create political independence. And that process clearly continues around the world. It's not limited to groups that have been colonized, but any group that has been exploited and oppressed.
There's another question like, how do you see the national identities shape a country's foreign policy? Are there implications of national identities in China-US relations or rivalry?
Well, so as I've argued, national identities don't really determine policies. If anything, policies are created for other reasons, and leaders try to justify them in terms of so-called national identities. But where I think the relevant response to this question should go is if we look at Chinese-American relations, there are really no deep-seated issues that should divide these countries with respect to either security or economics. I think what the conflict is mostly about is self-esteem. The Chinese are driven to assert their status in the world, still feeling sensitive from their period of humiliation in the 19th and early 20th century. The Americans have increasingly defined themselves as a hegemon, therefore feel threatened by the rise of China, not in a security sense, but in a psychological sense. And both sides are butting against each other for these reasons, although neither side is admitting to itself or the other about what its conflict is really about at its core. And until they recognize and address this self-esteem dimension, relations will not get better. And if the person who asked this question is interested, last year, I published a book with a mainland Chinese scholar, Feng Zhang, Z-H-A-N-G, called Taming Sino-American Rivalry, published by Oxford. You were kind enough to refer to it in your introduction, that takes up this very question in detail.
So the next question is, how crucial is an actor's identity in understanding global politics currently?
Well, again, I've argued that it's a misnomer, that identity doesn't tell us much of anything. What does tell us something are particular identifications that have been aroused and strengthened in people, which have importance. And they have importance because people believe in them, and people have connected their self-esteem with them. We have a lot of research on this. For example, with sports teams, if the stronger you affiliate with a particular club, or let's say a nation, if we refer to cricket, something which South Asians excel in, you feel good about yourself when your team wins, and you don't feel so good when they lose. If people can get us to identify with nations and to transfer our self-esteem to them, to live vicariously through their accomplishments, as we so often do with sports teams, then it has important implications for politics. And this is increasingly what has happened in the modern world.
So we're running out of time. So let me put the last question for today.
Yes.
What is the future of post-structuralism and constructivism in IR? How do you think the theory of ethnological security has and will impact IR?
Well, that's the subject of 3 more lectures. I won't go into post-structuralism. It's not my field. So I'll leave that for somebody else to answer. As for constructivism, I think it has a very positive future. And the reason for that is that it's based on more realistic assumptions about the world than, let's say, realism or positivism. It understands the social nature of all interactions, the ways in which these things are culturally and historically local, how when they evolve, understandings of behavior based on them are undermined and need to be reformulated. I think on the whole, constructivism offers a very good framework for thinking about international relations.
Professor Richard Ned Lebow, thank you very much for your wonderful discussion. We benefited a lot today. We are really honored by your kind presence. We hope to see you in Kathmandu in real or in other parts of the world once things get normal. We'd also like to thank our participants for the interesting questions. Professor Lebow, have a nice day and good night to our friends from Asia.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure spending this hour with all of you.